Mason Ridge sat high in northern Montana, where the pine line met a broad sky and the Clearwater River moved slow and sure through pasture land. Winters came early and hung on late. People measured seasons by the creak of porch boards and the bite of air in their lungs. On Sundays, half the town gathered at a small wooden church off Birch Street, where Father Turner said that peace, when it shows up, is a gift you tend like a garden. A mile off Main, a 2-story cedar house faced the river. It had a wide porch with 2 swing chairs and a front yard crowded with yellow chrysanthemums. This was the Miller place, and that porch was where John Miller, 70 years old, liked to sit with a chipped enamel mug of black coffee and watch the light move along the water. John had been a U.S. Army infantry sergeant for more than 2 decades. Iraq had taken a slice of his hearing and left him with a knee that clicked on cold mornings. He had learned to carry pain the way other men carry a wallet, close quiet, and not something you lay on the table. He used to tell folks there were 3 things the Army taught him better than any school: keep your word, mind your kit, and never turn your back on your people. 4 years earlier, his wife Margaret had died of lung cancer. After the funeral, he packed the boxes he couldn't bear to open and moved in with his eldest son, David Miller, a patrol officer assigned to the Mason Ridge district. David was 42, tall across the shoulders, steady on his feet, with a way of looking at a thing until it told him what it was. Around town they called him a straight shooter, and they meant it both ways. His wife, Emma, 38, ran the household with quiet good sense. They had 3 kids: Abigail, 17, thoughtful and decent; Jacob, 15, a handful most days but never mean; and Tommy, 10, more heart than bones and bound tight to his grandfather. Evenings at the Miller house were ordinary in the best sense. The pot simmered on the stove. Homework spread across the dining table. John tuned the old radio to Montana Public Radio and argued with the headlines in a low voice that made the kids grin. If you asked any of them then what tomorrow would bring, they would have said more of the same. But life never sits still just because you're fond of it. On a late autumn afternoon, the maples along River Road had turned the color of embers. John and David sat on the porch with fresh coffee sleeves pushed up against a breeze that smelled like pine and distant snow. David had been quiet all day, the way a man goes quiet when his mind is chewing on something hard. He finally said, "Got a problem brewing, Dad?" John didn't press. A good sergeant knows when to let a man load his own words. "Past 3 weeks," David went on, "we've had a run of strangers at the convenience stores along the east side. Late nights mostly. They buy personal stuff, hygiene cold meds, stomach pills, razors, the kind of supplies you'd need if you were holed up somewhere for a stretch." John watched a hawk tilt over the river. "You think they're camped in the woods?" "Could be," David said, "but that's not all." He looked toward the ridge as if the ridge might answer him. Clearwater turned up a lot of dead fish last week. No clear cause. And the Newmans lost 5 head of cattle in 2 days. Vet said he hadn't seen that kind of tox before. John's brow folded. He didn't say it out loud, but he felt the old tickle at the base of his skull, the one that arrived when pieces on the map started lining up on their own. "You think it's connected?" he said. "I do," David answered. "Just don't know how yet." John set his mug down the enamel rim, tapping the railing. "Our people have always served this town," he said. "Your great-granddad, your granddad, me now you. We didn't do it for a pension or for a plaque. We did it because you don't turn your back on the folks you live with. If you think something's wrong, you go to the end of it." David nodded once. "I will." They didn't speak more about it. They didn't need to. From that minute, the air around the house felt different, like the last half hour before a storm, when even the sparrows go quiet. Days slid by with their ordinary faces on. The kids caught the school bus. Emma planned Thanksgiving menus and shook her head at grocery prices. John fixed a loose hinge on the chicken coop and pretended his knee wasn't barking. David worked his shifts, checked on shut-ins out on Willow Lane, wrote up traffic near the high school, and followed threads nobody else yet saw. Peace kept its shape. Underneath, something moved. One evening near the end of the month, the sun fell early behind a wall of cloud, and the temperature dropped enough to silver the porch steps. They were halfway through dinner, Emma's beef stew hot and honest, when a crackle sounded from the police radio in the living room. David wiped his mouth, stepped in, and bent toward the speaker. Dispatch came thin and tight. Unit 12, we've got a report of suspicious individuals near Red Hollow Road. Repeat, Red Hollow Road. Possible connection to prior incidents. Request immediate response. David returned to the table, already zipping his jacket. Emma met his eyes. She didn't ask for promises. She just touched his sleeve. Maneroy, David called. The black shepherd rose from under the window like a shadow, learning to walk ears forward. The dog had been through more training than some recruits and wore it like a well-fitted vest. John stood on the porch as David and Maneroy went down the steps. Patrol lights washed the yard in red, then blue, then red again. David gave a quick wave and headed east, the quarter moon coming and going in the moving bank of cloud. It did not occur to any of them, not then, that this was the last time they'd see him standing straight in the doorway, shoulders set, walking out into the dark because the job asked him to. 9 o'clock came and went. Emma texted, then called. No answer. At 10, John tried David's cell and the unit line. Nothing. At 11, a friend from the department called the house to ask gently if David had swung by. He had not. The temperature kept falling. John searched the hall closet until he found 2 flashlights that still held a charge. He felt calm the way a river looks calm when it's deep enough to drown a buffalo. Call, he told Emma, everyone you can. I'm going to the truck. They fanned out family neighbors who loved them enough to come when asked, 2 off-duty officers who didn't wait for permission. Their bootsteps made hollow sounds on the frozen ground. Even the frogs along the ditch line were silent. It was almost midnight when Salvation found them on their own front lawn. Maneroy appeared, mud on his coat, a smear of dried blood on one shoulder. He didn't bark like a dog warns. He barked like a dog calls. He ran 10 yards and looked back, chest-heaving eyes on John. The old sergeant didn't waste words. Follow him. They did. Across the back pasture, through a break in the fence, onto the dirt track that cut toward the east side. The dog's paws hardly touched ground, and every few seconds he checked that they were still there. The wind picked up, carrying the metal tang of something John recognized a beat before he named it. Gunpowder. They reached the abandoned gas station off Red Hollow Road, a relic from 6 summers ago, with 2 dead pumps and a roofline that sagged like a tired back. David's patrol car sat at an angle near the front door, one headlight blown, the driver's door open to the cold. The windshield was spider-webbed. The dash lights glowed as if the car still believed the night would behave. Spent shells glittered under flashlight beams, a scatter pattern that told a quick, ugly story. The air smelled of burnt propellant and the iron of blood. A strip of police tape from some old training exercise fluttered on a fence post, mocking them in the beam. Maneroy led them around back to a corrugated metal storage shed. Its door hung crooked on one hinge. John took the left side without speaking. An officer took the right. Emma stood 10 paces back with Abigail's hand locked in hers. Jacob slid in front of Tommy as if his chest were a shield big enough to matter. On 3, John said. He didn't count out loud. They pushed in. The beam found David on the concrete floor. His shirt was dark with blood over the shoulder and along the ribs. One leg was twisted wrong. His face was the color weather turns wood just before it breaks. Maneroy lay against him, head-up eyes on John as if reporting. John knelt. He set his hand on his son's shoulder and felt the faint heat of a life refusing to go out. He didn't cry. He had done his crying 4 years before beside a hospital bed where the machines beeped at the same rate as his breaking heart. I'm here, he said, not loud, not soft. You stay. The helicopter came fast, chopping the darkness open with its roar. EMTs took over in a red-blue whirlwind. They loaded David, worked lines into him, and lifted away toward Billings where the bigger machines live. The others stood in the wash and watched until the sky swallowed the sound. By 2 in the morning, the shed was empty again, and frost had begun to lace the edges of the shell casings. John stood alone in the back lot, while Emma waited in the truck, the heater throwing weak warmth. He looked at the broken door, at the marks of the fight, at the bent grass where a body had been dragged or had crawled. He made himself memorize the scene, the way you memorize a face you may never see again. When he finally turned for home, the river sounded louder than it had in summer, though it flowed the same speed it always had. The town felt different, like a room where someone had just spoken a hard truth and no one knew what to do with it. The piece of Mason Ridge had been thin as breath, and now with one night's work, it was gone. The helicopter's red beacon disappeared into the dark, and the sound of the blades faded until it was only the wind again moving through the pines. The search party scattered back toward town, worn down to silence, each person carrying their own shape of fear. John rode with Emma and the kids to St. Mary's Medical Center in Billings, 2 hours away, though the drive felt longer than any road he had taken in wartime. ER lights were too bright for the hour. The hall smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. They waited in molded plastic chairs while surgeons worked to pull bullets out of David's shoulder, chest, and abdomen. Machines beeped behind walls they could not pass. A nurse with tired eyes came out once, then twice, then one last time. "We stabilized him," she said. "But the trauma to the brain is significant. We'll know more in the morning." Morning came. The news did not change. "He survived," the doctor said, hands folded in the pockets of his white coat. "But his brain isn't responding. We don't expect independent function." He paused. "I'm sorry. We believe this is a long-term vegetative state." Emma's knees buckled and John caught her before she fell. Abigail covered her mouth. Jacob stared at the wall. Tommy pressed his face into John's coat and stayed there. John didn't cry. Not in the waiting room. Not when the doctor left. Not when they walked into the ICU where David lay among machines whose lights blinked like distant constellations. He only took his son's hand, held it steady, and said, "You hold. Do you hear me? You hold." By noon, sheriff's office investigators had filed statements. Officers collected shell casings from the old gas station. Reporters from the local paper stood outside the hospital entrance, waiting for someone to come out shaken and talk too soon. The police chief, Cole Henderson, a man who had arrived to Mason Ridge 2 months earlier from Helena, called a press briefing the next day. It was short. It was clinical. It was devastating. "We have reason to believe Officer David Miller was in contact with a narcotics organization operating in the Mason Ridge area," Henderson said, reading from the paper instead of facing the crowd. "We suspect a financial dispute led to the altercation." The words hit the town like a hammer. The Miller family had lived in Mason Ridge for generations. John's father had worked the grain elevators by the tracks. His grandfather had helped build the water tower. David had grown up playing Little League on the ball field behind the Methodist church. People had waved to him when he drove his patrol car down Main. But all it took was one official statement, and 70 years of respect turned to doubt overnight. Outside the grocery, 2 men leaned on a pickup and spoke just loud enough. "Knew that boy was too clean. No one's that clean unless they're hiding something." On the sidewalk near the post office, a woman who had once asked David to help her get her son out of legal trouble shook her head at Emma when she passed. "What a shame," the woman murmured, not quietly. "Thought they were better than that." Even neighbors who had eaten at the Miller table pulled their curtains a little closer when they saw John out on the porch. Word spread faster than truth ever could. Sold out to dealers, got greedy, brought shame to the badge. Emma tried to go to the grocery store one morning to buy fruit for the hospital. She walked in carrying her list. The cashier, a man David had once shielded from a bar fight, saw her coming and withdrew his hand so it would not touch hers when she paid. She walked out without saying a word. She sat in the car for a long time, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. At school, Jacob swung at a boy who spit the sentence, "Your dad's a drug cop for the drug guys." The principal called home. John was the one who went to get him. On the front lawn, Tommy once asked, "Grandpa, are we bad people now?" John knelt, took the boy's face in both hands, and said very softly, "No, we are not bad people. We just live in a town that's forgotten who we are." But later that night, when the house was quiet, he stood on the porch alone and stared across the fields into the wild dark. He had seen enemies before, men in uniforms different from his men, who shot from rooftops or hid roadside bombs under trash piles. Those were enemies you could name. But this was something that seeped, something that hid, something that shook a man from the inside out. And then something else happened, something small but sharp enough to stay with him. The next Sunday at the church on Birch Street, they walked in as they always had. John seated Emma, then Abby and Jacob, then Tommy. The service was quiet. Afterward, as families filtered outside, some stopped to speak, but most did not. A few nodded politely, but stepped away quickly. One woman let her children hide behind her skirt. Another man, a man John had served beside on the volunteer fire line during wildfire season, avoided his eyes entirely. Then came the words that landed like blows. A voice behind him, low but not low enough. "Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." John turned. The speaker, a man he had lent tools to 3 summers running, did not look ashamed. John didn't raise his voice. He only said, "You don't know, my son." To which the man replied with a shrug that stung more than the words. No one ever really knows anyone, do they? This, John realized, was how a community falls apart, not with violence, but with doubt. Back at the house, John stood on the porch where he and David had once shared coffee. The wind carried the thin smell of burning leaves. The horizon was flat and wide and endless. He had buried his wife with honor. He would not bury his son's name. Not while he was still breathing. He walked inside, picked up the phone from the wall, and dialed a number he knew by memory, even after 30 years. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, gravelly, warm, and still, carrying the cadence of men who had learned to shout over helicopter rotors. "Yeah, this is Kevin Jackson." John didn't waste time. "It's John," he said. "I need you in Mason Ridge." There was a pause, not hesitation, just understanding. "When do I get there?" Kevin asked. John looked toward the ridgeline where the pines cut dark shapes against the evening sky. "Tonight," he said. Kevin arrived just past midnight in a gray Ford that looked like it had gone through one war and decided it could handle another. He was 72, same as John, though he carried his age differently, rougher maybe, but with a grin that made people underestimate him. He hugged Emma. He tousled the boy's hair. He put a hand on John's shoulder and squeezed. Then he sat at the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of the blackest coffee in the house, and listened while John told him everything, every detail, every scrap of evidence, every absence of evidence that didn't sit right. When John finished, Kevin nodded once. "What do we know?" he asked. John answered, "We know the story they told isn't the truth." "And what do we do about that?" Kevin said. John looked at his oldest friend, the man who had pulled him out of gunfire on a road outside Fallujah, the man who had once said dying was easy, but living with dishonor was hell. "We find the truth," John said, "no matter where it leads." Kevin smiled, slow and dangerous. "Then let's go get it." Kevin slept a few hours on the couch and was up before dawn, the way old soldiers wake sharp alert, as if someone had whispered orders into their dreams. John was already on the porch, hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had cooled in the Montana air. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. Some things are understood in silence. By mid-morning, they were standing in the parking lot of Gus's Convenience and Fuel, one of the 2 stores on the east side where David had seen the late-night visitors. The clerk, a wiry man named Dale Henderson, no relation to the police chief, watched them approach with caution. Folks in town were still uneasy around the Millers. John didn't bother with small talk. "My son came here," he said. "He was tracking some people. We need the security footage." Dale shifted on his feet. Sheriff's department already pulled those tapes. Kevin stepped closer, not threatening but present. A presence built in deserts and barracks and roadside checkpoints. "We're not asking what the sheriff took," Kevin said. "We're asking what he didn't know to look for." Dale swallowed and flicked his eyes to the back room. 5 minutes later, they were watching grainy black and white footage on an old monitor. The timestamp read 11:36 p.m. 6 nights earlier. A group of 5 men entered the store, hoodies up, faces mostly turned down, but not with the bravado of small-time delinquents. They moved with coordination. Eyes tracked corners. Their hands didn't fidget. These were men used to watching doors. They filled baskets with basic supplies: razors, shaving cream, electrolyte powder, generic ibuprofen, toothbrushes, blister packs of cold medicine. Nothing illegal, nothing flashy. But the quantity told a different story. "Stocking a home base," Kevin murmured. "Remote, off-grid, or at least hidden." John rewound the footage and watched again, slow. One man stayed outside, leaning against a silver Ford F-250 with a tarp-covered bed. John memorized his walk, shoulders forward, chin slightly tucked, head scanning like a rangefinder. Military, or paramilitary, or trained by someone who was. "Play the outside camera," John said. There was only one. Angled wrong, grainy, but enough to catch the silhouette of the truck and part of the license plate. 6B927 something, Montana plate. Hard to read, but not impossible. They copied what they needed, thanked Dale, and left. They took the long way home through Clearwater Road, past the area where fish had washed ashore like silver leaves scattered by an invisible wind. The river looked normal now, cold and smooth under a pale sky. But John could sense something wrong beneath it, like a note in a song played just a little off-key. Back home, Kevin pulled out a notebook. Not a laptop, not a phone, a plain spiral-bound notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. "Thought you'd gone digital," John said, settling into the chair across from him. "Nah," Kevin said. "Digital gets erased. Paper doesn't forget." They wrote. 5 individuals in consistent rotation, purchasing long-term survival supplies. Transport vehicle Ford F-250, Silverchair Gray. Partial tag 6B927. Behavior suggests training. Operating from a remote location. Likely connected to environmental contamination in water and livestock. They drove to the sheriff's office parking lot, but didn't go in. John watched the building from across Main Street, leaning against his truck. He scanned the cars, the comings and goings, familiar faces, moving with practiced routines. But something had settled over the place like a layer of dust you couldn't see unless you knew how to look. "Someone in there knows something," John said. "Yeah," Kevin answered. "Question is whether they're scared or bought." John said nothing. The partial plate was enough. They ran it through a friend of Kevin's still working part-time with the Montana Highway Patrol Records Department. To avoid suspicion, she didn't send details electronically. She read it over the phone in a clipped tone. Plate registered to Burns Logging Company, but the company shut down 8 years ago. Property still owned by a shell corporation out of Bozeman. No current listed operations. Kevin's eyes narrowed. "Logging company" means what he asked John. "Access roads," John answered, "and buildings with no one watching." They drove out of town, heading into the hills. The roads changed from pavement to gravel, from gravel to dirt, from dirt to something that barely counted as a road at all. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of tires crunching frost. An old logging road branched off toward the ridge. A faded sign, half swallowed by tall grass, read, "Granite Pass Processing Mill Closed." They parked the truck behind a stand of spruce and continued on foot. The building sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, a long, low warehouse structure with rust-dulled metal siding. Once it had been a place where timber was stripped, cut, and shipped. Now there was no sound of saws, no trucks, no workers. But there were lights. Dim, controlled. Not enough to draw attention from afar. Enough for people who already knew where to look. And guards. 2 at the front, 1 walking perimeter, rifles slung not holstered. John and Kevin slid behind an outcrop of old equipment, twisted conveyor arms, and rusted gears coated in moss. They observed in silence. Then John pointed to the back of the warehouse, specifically to a series of metal pipes running from the building down into a narrow stream that fed the Clearwater River. The water trickling out was cloudy, oily, chemical. "There's the fish," John whispered. "And the cattle," Kevin said. "Drug manufacturing runoff," John added, "probably volatile compounds from synthesis." "Which means not just distribution," Kevin finished. "Production. Right here in Mason Ridge." A cold realization settled over them like winter descending all at once. David had found this, and someone had made sure he would never speak about it. They stayed until nightfall, watching shift changes, patrol routes, supply drops. They counted bodies. They mapped blind spots. They listened. Not with equipment, just with the senses that had kept them alive once already. By midnight they retreated silently to the truck and drove home under a moon that looked too pale for the world it hung over. At the kitchen table they spread out their notes, sketches, and estimated headcounts. "We're looking at a large-scale meth and synthetic opioid lab," Kevin said. "With armed security," John added. "And supply lines," Kevin continued. "And nobody in town questioning a thing," John said. They both sat back. The silence felt heavy, like a question neither wanted to ask. Finally, Kevin spoke. "David didn't go bad." "No," John said. "He got close. And someone in uniform shut him down." John's gaze hardened, not angry, not wild, but focused. Razor sharp. "We're not going to the sheriff," he said. "No," Kevin agreed. "We find proof. And when we have it, we go to someone who can't be bought." "That'll take time," John said. Kevin nodded. "We've got time." John looked toward the closed ICU room in his mind where machines breathed for his son. "No," he said quietly, "we don't. The next step would not be patience. It would be action. And the mountain would feel it." For the next several days, John and Kevin worked in the quiet way men work when they know time is running out. They did not speak to neighbors. They did not return calls from the sheriff's office. They visited David in the ICU every morning and every night, standing beside the bed long enough to steady themselves, then leaving before the weight of grief could stall them. Outside the hospital windows, the Montana winter crept deeper into the trees. Inside, something else was freezing the resolve of 2 old soldiers. They began their surveillance at Granite Pass before dawn, after dusk, and sometimes in the thin stretch of afternoon when shadows were longest. There was no doubt now. The old logging mill had been converted into a drug manufacturing site, industrial-sized reactors, ventilation fans disguised as abandoned fixtures, trucks arriving mostly at night, no plates or plates swapped before leaving the valley. The men guarding the structure weren't amateurs. Their stance, their spacing, their line-of-sight discipline, these were not backwoods criminals. "Private contractors," Kevin said one evening, glassing the perimeter from the tree line with an old pair of Steiner binoculars. "Former military, former security contractors? Hard to say from here." John nodded. The movements were familiar, too familiar. A man never forgets how trained fighters breathe. But the breakthrough came on the 5th night of observation. A black SUV rolled down the access road, slow and controlled. It did not belong. It did not match the other vehicles. Bulletproof government-grade suspension factory tint on the windows. The guards straightened when it arrived, not like they were greeting equals but superiors. The passenger door opened. Sheriff Cole Henderson stepped out. John felt something in his chest go still, not anger, not surprise, just confirmation. He watched the sheriff confer with a tall man whose face was hidden behind the SUV's open door. They spoke for less than 2 minutes. No gestures, no raised voices. When the man finally stepped out of view, John caught only the polished shoe, the tailored slacks, the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. Not a local dealer, not a cartel soldier. Someone higher. Someone who moved budgets and votes, not street crews. Kevin lowered the binoculars and exhaled. "Well," he said, "that's our leak." "And that's our lock," John replied. "Whoever that man is, he's the one running this." "Sheriff's just the middle gear," Kevin said. "They always use a hometown face to grease the wheels." They stayed until the SUV disappeared into the trees again. Neither spoke for a long time. The next morning they drove into Helena, not to the sheriff's office, not to the state police, not to anyone who might already be compromised. They went to Walt Ramsey, a retired Army intelligence officer who ran a small veteran support center out of an old brick building across from the rail yard. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the walls were lined with faded photos of men in uniform smiling like they didn't yet know how heavy the world could be. Walt listened as John laid everything out slow plain without embellishment. When John finished, Walt leaned back and folded his hands across his stomach. "You're telling me Mason Ridge is sitting on a full-scale synthetic op facility," Walt said, "staffed by ex-military, protected by local law enforcement, and run by someone with political reach." "Yes," John said simply. Walt didn't doubt him. Men who had seen combat recognized a certain steadiness in the eyes. John had it now. "You know, I can't take this to state authorities," Walt said. "They'll bury it before your tires cool." "That's why we came here," Kevin said. Walt stared at the far wall. Behind that wall were trains carrying coal across the state, trains that had seen more miles than the men who drove them. "I've got someone," Walt finally said. "DEA, Counter-Trafficking Division, woman named Alana Ruiz. Smart, hard, doesn't look the other way." He slid a notepad across the table, a phone number written in block print. "But listen to me," Walt said. "You don't call her until you have proof. Hard proof? Photographs, audio, shipment logs, the works. There won't be a second chance." "No," Walt said, "there won't." John nodded once. It was the same nod he had used before stepping out of a Humvee into Fallujah. A nod that meant understood. That night they went back to Granite Pass, this time with purpose. They did not approach the front. They did not break perimeter. They watched patterns, movements, and timing. 2 trucks arrived every third night. Chemicals, hydrogen peroxide drums, pseudoephedrine shipments, solvent canisters were stored in the north warehouse, where a side office had been converted into a control center. And behind that office, connected to a narrow stairwell leading into a second-floor observation catwalk, were security terminals and recording drives. Evidence. The kind no judge or agent could ignore. They confirmed guard rotation further, mapped blind spots, measured time between shifts. Every movement, every count, every sound written down in Kevin's notebook. When they finished, Kevin tore the page out cleanly and slid it to John. "You realize what we're going to have to do," he said. John didn't flinch. "We go in," he said. "We get the proof, and we get out." Kevin gave a thin smile. "Guess retirement doesn't stick to either of us." John looked toward the valley, toward the silent warehouse, the poisoned stream, the river that ran past the house where his grandchildren slept. "It never does," he said. Days grew colder, nights grew sharper, and the town's judgment grew more pointed. Someone spray-painted the word "traitor" on the Miller mailbox. Abigail cleaned it before her mother saw. Jacob stood by the road with a baseball bat until the sun rose. Tommy cried quietly where no one saw. John said nothing. Because the truth was almost ready. Because the mountain was about to speak. Because the men who had broken his son's body had not yet understood. They had left the wrong soldier alive. The cold came early that winter, Snow dusted the pines at Granite Pass, whitening the valley like a shroud. The old logging mill sat beneath it, still silent and wrong, in a way the mountains seemed to carry like a bruise. John and Kevin didn't speak much in the days leading up to the operation. Words were heavy now. Planning took their breath. Memory took the rest. They moved with the same old rhythm, one man thinking ahead, the other watching the rear. They had everything they needed. Entry timing between 1:17 a.m. and 1:32 a.m. when guard rotation doubled back. 2 blind corners on the west side of the building. A maintenance stairwell leading directly to the security control room. And most importantly, explosives. Not military grade. They didn't have that anymore. But ANFO explosive is sold legally in Montana. You just call it blasting compound for winter rock and stump clearing. They bought it from a quarry supplied 2 towns over, paid cash, didn't ask for receipts. Sunset came early that day. At 5 p.m. they sat at the kitchen table while Emma prepared plates neither of them would eat. Tommy watched them quietly. "Grandpa," he said, voice small but certain, "are you going because of Dad?" John rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm going," he said, "because someone tried to take your father's honor, and we don't let people take what doesn't belong to them." Tommy nodded like he understood, maybe not everything, but enough. When they left, Emma did not cry. She just hugged them both and whispered, "Bring each other home." They reached Granite Pass just past 1 in the morning. The sky was moonless, but there was enough starlight to see the valley's outline. The warehouse glowed faintly, low yellow light seeping through metal siding seams. John and Kevin moved fast and low through the tree-lined packs, strapped close rifles wrapped to dull reflection. They counted guards, checked watches, and breathed in through their noses, out through their mouths. Old training resurfaced, not like memory, but like instinct. At the west wall, they slid behind a rusted conveyor system, half swallowed by vines. Kevin pulled wire cutters. John watched the guard's footsteps. 3 steps forward, stop, 3 steps back. They knew his rhythm before he did. The fence gave way with a quiet click. They slipped through. Inside the yard, the snow was packed flat from traffic. Footprints, tire marks, patterns like veins across the frozen ground. They kept close to the building wall under the shadow of the overhang. At the maintenance stairwell, John tested the door handle. Unlocked. He and Kevin exchanged the kind of look men use when a thing is too easy. They didn't speak. They entered. The stairwell was narrow steel, great steps, echoing too loudly for comfort. They moved 1 step at a time, slow, precise, rifles up. At the second level, they slipped into the control hallway. Through a small glass panel, they saw the security room, 3 monitors, 2 men drinking cheap coffee, one of them flipping through a phone. They didn't kick the door. They waited. When the man on the phone stood to stretch back, turned, John opened the door, silent and sudden. Kevin was there before sound could happen. 2 soft strikes, one to the throat, one to the jaw, laid the first man down. John took the second. No bullets fired. No alarms. They worked like men who had learned a long time ago that noise is a luxury. They took everything. Hard drives, USB backups, printed transport schedules, video recordings of chemical shipments, ledger sheets with initials and amounts, and one photograph, Sheriff Cole Henderson shaking hands with the same well-dressed man they had glimpsed behind the SUV. The caption on the back read, "Governor Clay Harrington, private visit 2022. The mountain didn't just hide criminals, it hid power." Kevin whistled low. "Hell of a snake pit we've got here." "We're not done," John said. Because as they were packing up, they heard something new, engines starting, trucks loading, voices calling inventory. They looked at each other. The operation was ending. The lab was being evacuated. If the lab emptied tonight, every trace would be gone. Evidence mattered, but time mattered more. John's voice came steady. "We stopped the trucks." Kevin nodded. "Blasting caps." John tapped the side of his pack. They moved fast to the reactor floor, the heart of the manufacturing. The air smelled like ammonia and gasoline, and something so chemical it made the eyes burn. John placed charges on the mixer vats, the solvent storage, the main distribution pump, and the drainage line feeding the river. Kevin set his at the vehicle loading dock, stacking 2 charges under the fuel tanks of the largest distribution trucks. When they finished, they ducked behind a forklift and John pressed the detonator. The world did not explode, it collapsed. A deep, muffled whoomp roared like thunder in the gut of the valley. Fire bloomed upward, a rolling blossom of orange and black that punched open the warehouse roof. Light poured out the windows like the building was now a lantern for the dead. Men shouted, metal screamed, tires burst. And suddenly, gunfire. Rifles cracked through the mountain air. Bullets skipped sparks off steel. Voices in Spanish and English collided. Kevin yelled over the roar. They're trying to run for the access road. John fired 3 shots, controlled and steady, front sights clear, breath calm like range practice from 50 years ago. 1 truck lost a tire, another spun sideways. But the third was still pushing through the smoke. Kevin didn't think, or maybe he did and made the kind of choice men only make once. He sprinted toward John's truck parked by the tree line, jumped in, slammed the ignition, and floored it. Kevin. The pickup barreled downhill engine, screaming headlights cutting through flame and ash. Kevin aimed not at the men, no. He aimed at the lead vehicle, the one that would clear the road and let all the others escape. The impact was violent. Metal crashed into metal. The truck rolled. Fire followed in a hungry roar. The burning wreck blocked the only exit from the valley. But Kevin didn't get back up. The air smelled like fuel and burning pine. Snow melted under the heat. The world flickered orange and black. John ran. He did not feel his age. He did not feel his knee. He only felt that Kevin was still his responsibility. He found him half-conscious beside the overturned truck, blood in his hair coat smoldering. Kevin's voice was thin but still his. Don't you dare leave me here, John Miller. John hauled him onto his back. The weight was heavy but familiar, like carrying a brother, like carrying memory. Bullets snapped past them. Shouts rose behind. Boots pounded closer. They did not have minutes. They had seconds. John stumbled through snow and shale, breath-ragged vision blurred, until a sound split the sky. Not gunfire, not explosion. Helicopter rotors. Big ones. Searchlights tore open the valley darkness. Then Engine 6, maybe more, roaring up the mountain road. DA, FBI, federal marshals. A voice boomed through speakers. Drop your weapons and stand down. This is federal jurisdiction. John collapsed behind a rock outcropping, Kevin still on his back, lungs burning. He didn't remember falling. He only remembered the relief in his bones when boots not belonging to criminals knelt beside him. When someone said, "We've got them. You're safe. You did good." The last thing John saw before the dark took him was the mill burning like a funeral pyre. Not just for the crime that had been done there, but for the lie that had tried to bury his son. When John woke, everything was white. White ceiling, white walls, the slow, steady beep of a heart monitor, the kind of quiet that feels too clean to be real. He blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. His body hurt in a way that didn't have edges, just one long pulse of exhaustion. Then he heard breathing beside him, heavy, familiar. Kevin lay in the bed next to his, wrapped in bandages from shoulder to rib. One eye bruised purple and swollen. His chest rose and fell, slow, steady. Alive. John let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. A nurse stepped in, her name badge reading Nurse Harper, her voice gentle but sure. "You're at St. Mary's," she said. "You've been here 3 days. You both came in by federal evac medevac. You're safe." Safe. The word didn't land. Not yet. "You should know," Nurse Harper continued, her voice softening. "There are agents who want to speak to you. but they've been told to wait until you're ready." John nodded once. He wasn't ready. Not for questions, not for reports, not for what came next. He needed one thing first. "David," he said, his voice cracked. "My son." Nurse Harper paused, kind-measured. "He's alive," she said, "still in ICU. No change in status since the night you arrived." The words should have hurt, but for John they were something like hope. Still alive meant still fighting, and John had learned a long time ago that some fights take longer than others. By the afternoon, visitors came. Not local law enforcement, not reporters. Federal agents. The first to enter was DEA Special Agent Alana Ruiz, dark hair, tied back, sharp eyes, posture of someone who had spent years learning when to stay quiet. She didn't sit. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we have a lot to cover, but first, thank you." John wasn't used to gratitude, especially not for things that felt like survival more than choice. Ruiz continued. "We raided the facility at Granite Pass, 43 arrests, 7 confirmed linked to cartel distribution networks in New Mexico and Arizona. We seized over $12 million in product, and we have enough recorded evidence to prosecute the entire supply chain." John nodded. He didn't feel triumph, he felt tired. But Ruiz wasn't done. The Sheriff Cole Henderson was arrested on site after resisting. He's already cooperating under federal counsel. He has named his contact. Kevin stirred in the bed beside him. "And who's that?" Kevin murmured, voice rough like gravel and whiskey. Ruiz didn't blink. "Governor Clay Harrington." Silence filled the room. Not shocked silence, but the silence of realization becoming certainty. Kevin hissed out a quiet breath. "Political cover," he muttered. "Funding, protection. Makes sense." Ruiz nodded. "We have recordings, financial ledgers, shipment orders signed under shell corporations linked to Harrington's personal donors. Your surveillance provided the keystone we needed." John didn't smile, but something in his shoulders loosened. "And the town?" he asked. Ruiz didn't answer right away. "Public perception takes time to correct," she said finally. "But we'll make sure the right story is the one that stands." John nodded. Truth didn't need applause, it only needed to be known. That night, when the hospital had settled into the kind of quiet that only machines break, John asked the nurse to wheel his bed into David's room. And she did. The ICU was dim, lit only by the soft monitors keeping rhythm. David lay still, the same as before, pale but alive. John sat beside him. Kevin beside John in a wheelchair. He insisted on rolling himself. No one spoke. Some silences aren't empty. Some silences are prayer. Hours passed. Then David's left hand twitched. Small, barely a movement. But John saw it. He stood. "David," he said, soft, not commanding. "Son, I'm here." David's eyelids fluttered. His breathing paused, hitched, then steadied. His voice was a whisper, hoarse-thin, but unmistakably his. They cut the signal," he murmured. "Sheriff, Henderson, shut the radio. I tried to call it in." John bowed his head. He already knew, but hearing it from his son's mouth was something else. David continued, tears forming at his temples. "I didn't, Dad. I didn't do what they said I did." John took his son's hand and pressed it against his chest. "I know," he said, and his voice broke not from pain but from relief so deep it was almost grief. "I never believed otherwise." David's eyes closed, not from weakness but from rest. For the first time since the gunshots at the gas station, there was peace in his face. Beside them, Kevin wiped at his eyes and pretended he was adjusting his bandage instead. "Kid's tougher than both of us," he said, voice low. John huffed something like a quiet laugh. "Always was." By morning, the news broke statewide. Governor Harrington arrested in federal drug trafficking sting. Mason Ridge woke up to headlines that burned away every rumor, every whisper, every insult spoken when they thought they knew the truth. Not everyone apologized, but everyone learned something. Sometimes the quietest man in town is the one holding the line. John and Kevin were released from the hospital a week later. No ceremony, no parade. Just two old soldiers walking out into cold November air, exhausted, scarred, but standing. The kind of standing that means something. The kind of standing that is earned. Veterans Day arrived with a thin frost on the rooftops and a soft wind blowing down from Granite Pass. The sky was the cold, bright kind of blue that Montana seemed to save for moments that mattered. Mason Ridge's town square wasn't large, just a brick courtyard with a flagpole, a stone memorial, and a stretch of benches facing the gazebo. But that morning people filled it. Families, farmers, teachers, kids from the high school holding their breath like they knew today held more weight than usual. There were no marching bands, no parade. Just people standing together in the cold. John walked slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Kevin was beside him, moving stiffly but upright. David followed a step behind, leaning on a walker and moving carefully, but moving under his own strength. Emma and the children surrounded him like a shield made of love instead of steel. When the town saw David alive, awake, standing, something shifted. People who had once turned away now stood still. People who had whispered now bowed their heads, and some quietly began to cry. The mayor stepped to the small podium. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled. Today, he said, we gather not just to honor service in uniform, but to honor the courage to stand for what is right, even when the world chooses the easy lie over the difficult truth. He paused, letting the weight settle. We owe a debt not only to Officer David Miller, whose integrity never wavered, but to Sergeant John Miller and Sergeant Kevin Jackson, who reminded us that courage does not retire. John didn't move. He didn't smile. He just listened as soldiers do. The mayor continued. On behalf of the town of Mason Ridge, the state of Montana, and the United States of America, we recognize and thank you. But John stepped forward not to speak for applause, but to set the record right. He removed his cap. The wind caught the edges of his hair. His voice was quiet, but in that silence the whole town could hear every word. I didn't do what I did for thanks, John said. I didn't do it to make a point. I did it because my son tells the truth, because my friend stands his ground, because this town is our home, and a home is something you protect. He looked at the faces, some ashamed, some relieved, some simply listening. War teaches you something, he said. It teaches you that enemies aren't always far away. Sometimes they sit close. Sometimes they shake your hand. Sometimes they wear the same badge you do. A murmur went through the crowd, not outrage, but understanding. But it also teaches you something else, John continued. It teaches you that honor is not a medal. Honor is what you do when no one is cheering. Honor is choosing the truth when the lie would be easier. He looked back at David, whose eyes were shining. We are not defined by the wounds we carry. We are defined by the things we refuse to let die. He stepped back. No applause came right away. Instead, something better happened. The crowd stood in silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that holds respect. Then slowly, one hand at a time, people began to clap. Not loud, not frantic, but steady, like a heartbeat. A salute not of arms, but of acknowledgement. And standing there, 3 generations of the Miller family together, John felt the weight he'd been carrying finally ease. Not disappear. War and loss never leave completely. But ease, because honor had not been lost, not in the mountains, not in the town, not in his son. It had simply needed someone to hold it until others remembered how. As the sun lowered and families began to drift away, David took his father's arm. Dad, he said quietly, thank you for not letting them bury me. John placed a hand over his son's. No, son, he answered. You fought your way back. I just held the line. Kevin laughed raspy and warm. Least he's honest about it. They all turned toward home, toward the porch, with the swing chairs, the garden of chrysanthemums, the life that was always worth protecting. The town behind them was not perfect, but it remembered now. and that mattered. The wind moved through the pines overhead. The Clearwater River ran cold and clean again. And somewhere in the distance a flag flapped softly against its pole. Not as decoration, but as a promise. As we come to the close of this story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you, the listener, the witness, the keeper of these memories. Stories like John's remind us that a soldier's duty does not end when the uniform is folded and placed away. The battlefield may change, no longer distant deserts or foreign streets, but the call to protect, to stand for what is right, remains stitched into the very spirit of those who once served. Many veterans carry scars that cannot be seen, the memories they cannot put into words, the loyalty that outlives the wars themselves. And yet their greatest strength is not found in the battles they fought overseas, but in the quiet bravery they show when they carry that honor back home into their families, their communities, and their everyday lives. This story is not just about uncovering corruption or restoring a name. It is about the endurance of honor. It is about the love of a father for his son. It is about brotherhood, the kind that survives time, distance, and even fire. As Veterans Day comes, may we remember every man and woman who answered the call to serve. May we look at them not only with gratitude, but with understanding. Because even after the uniform is gone, they continue to stand guard in ways we may never fully see. To every veteran listening, thank you for your service, for your sacrifice, for your strength, quiet and steadfast. To our community here, thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story moved you, if it made you remember someone you love or someone who once served, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, stories of courage, resilience, and the unseen battles fought after the war. We have many more stories to tell, stories of veterans, of family of honor that refuses to fade. Thank you for being here. And until we meet again, take care, stay warm, and keep your heart strong. We'll see you in the next story.